Congress, the third edition, and this is the first session. Thank you, Glory, for that introduction. So let's get started. This session will concentrate on the African Continental Free Trade Area. I have our guests, our panelists joining us right now. I will start the first question from Dr. Martins Davids. Dr. Martins, one of the unique attributes of the African Continental Free Trade Area is the scope of coverage, unlike several regional free trade agreements in Africa, which primarily focuses on the trade in goods. And the agreement also covers services, dispute resolution, investment policy, competition, and intellectual property rights. Let's focus on the last three areas. How do you see these rules playing out in practice? What challenges do you envisage for the AfTA as it would impede the implementation, so to speak? So what do you envisage that the AfTA will have implementing the rules, and what impact do you think it would also have on the private sector? Dr. Davids.
Nancy, thank you very much, and good to see them. Thank you very much, everybody, for the kind invitation to contribute. Just a couple of thoughts, if I may. Nancy, you know, the free trade project is indeed very ambitious, which you allude to. Free trade ultimately is about liberalization of what I call flows, four flows. Flows of goods, which is obvious. The flows of services, where perhaps there's opportunities. The flows of labor, i.e. Sort of talent, and ultimately the flows of capital, be it finance. I think we have to be realistic here. This is a long-term project, of course. There's going to be no short-term wins. Secondly, and I think what we'll touch on later in the conversation, I'm sure, is a perennial conversation about lack of enabling infrastructure. I'm afraid to say, don't shoot the messenger, is that a lot of landlocked countries in Africa will not be able to benefit from free trade other than trade in services. And this is something which ironically has been sort of accelerated through this COVID period and possibly post-COVID period because of the adoption of digital technologies and the like. So that certainly provides an opportunity. I think realistically what we'll see is certain more accurately coastal economies benefiting, particularly where established trade relations currently exist. These are the countries which stand to gain, or the sort of these economies stand to gain the most by liberalization of trade. My second point, however, is that what my general observation is across the continent currently, and the former president was talking about building back better. I totally agree with that, and he made a very crucial point about private sector driven. However, what I'm observing is that increased protectionism, a trend towards import substitution, and we should not equate import substitution with industrial strategy. We have to clearly think through and balance the need for proactive industrial strategy, arguably, and free trade liberalization, and how do those two intersect and be applied in a very, very pragmatic fashion. I think that is the key here. And the third and last point is that I'll talk about, you mentioned about the sort of, the grand project we speak about, intellectual property rights, services, etc. I think, what you're going to find in majority of landlocked countries in our region, I think, Central Africa in particular, is these are countries that have practically zero comparative advantage in terms of benefiting from trade of goods and services. That infrastructure is highly inflationary. And I think, how do these countries develop by exports of these services? I think that is something that is crucial. However, from a policy-making perspective, services are often harder to understand, to evaluate, and ultimately for the state to sort of, I think, ultimately enable as well. So these are the issues going forward. I just want to put that out there, just some initial thoughts, Nancy, in terms of what are the challenges. As I said, this is a long-term project, but one which I think we need to try and find some immediate short-term wins, but those will be very few. It's a long road ahead, and let's look towards almost a runway of a decade here before we see substantive progress. I think at a more continental level beyond the sort of sub-regional short-term wins. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I'll come back to you later. Engineer Mansour, I can see you. You know, one of the prevalent problems in Africa today is infrastructural deficit, which has contributed to a high cost of production on the continent and as in even other times. Oh, okay. Engineer Mansour, I'll come back. I hope you can hear me now. You know that one of the...
I can hear you, please.
Good, good, Engineer Ahmed. One of the prevalent problems we have in Africa...
Go ahead, I can hear you.
One of the prevalent problems we have in Africa is that of infrastructural deficit, which has contributed to a very high cost of production on the continent and has in other times also crippled production capacity. Given your experience as the head of Manufacturers Association of Nigeria and an executive of a company doing business across Africa, what impact do you think that infrastructural deficit would have on the implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area? And what do you think can be done to address this deficit?
Well, thank you very much. Let me first of all apologize for joining this meeting very late. I was supposed to take an early morning flight from Kaduna. Unfortunately, it was delayed. And of course, the Lagos traffic didn't help matters. So I came in rather late. Yes, indeed, the infrastructure deficit has been a major, major cause of our inability, particularly in most developing and African countries in particular, to be able to not only participate in trade effectively, but also to grow our economies as effectively as we should. Infrastructure is critical to effective economic activity, any economic activity. But for manufacturing in particular, which I think particularly in the issue with regards to the issue of trade in goods, at least, it is absolutely critical. Without effective, requisite infrastructure, particularly national as well as in this context, regional and continental infrastructure, participation in global trade, in continental trade, in regional trade becomes very difficult because you cannot be competitive if you don't have the infrastructure that is absolutely vital for effective operations at the farm level, but also for effective movement of goods and services across from farm to market. And I think this is compounded by the general suggestion that if you are to trade across borders, clearly you need the cross-border infrastructure as well. So within the domestic environment, within the local market, what we experience in most African countries is that the infrastructure is inadequate where it is available is weak, particularly energy infrastructure, which is vital to effective productivity, transport infrastructure, infrastructure services such as maritime infrastructure services, roads, railways, etc. If I can give an example in Nigeria, the problem is that, first of all, each of these infrastructure is totally inadequate. Nigeria, the energy infrastructure, power, for instance, we are generating and supplying to consumers probably less than a quarter of what will be normally required to ensure that we can use energy as competitively. We can produce at energy costs that are competitive with other regions. The same thing with with the transport infrastructure, where the cost of transporting goods and services are so high because the infrastructure is not there. The roads are not good. They're not even there. Where they are there, they are not very good, and therefore it costs a lot more to transport your goods and services from your farm to the market than it would in other normal regimes. So clearly, if we are going to participate effectively in this continental market, we must do two things. At the domestic level, at the nation-state level, we must significantly improve local infrastructure to be able to bring costs of production down and cost of transport, cost of business as a whole, down to a level which ensures competitiveness. Secondly, at the the regional and continental level, cross-border infrastructure must also significantly be scaled up, not only in terms of the hard infrastructure, but also infrastructure in terms of the facilitation, the infrastructure that facilitates businesses, that facilitates transactions, that facilitates trade. And all these are weak within the region at the moment. So a lot has to be done if the continental free trade area agreement is to indeed benefit our economies as exemplary, or indeed to help grow our economies. However, yes, a lot can be done. First of all, of course, at the national level, one of the things we have to do is to try and prioritize the production, the supply of infrastructure services to hubs, production hubs, so that you create regions of, if you like, economic infrastructure where companies or producers can be competitive. Also, across the region, you must build the necessary cross-border infrastructure. The roads across and railway systems and the corridors that serve trade there must be consistent and coordinated approach to promote the development of those corridors in such a way that the trade becomes more effective, more cost-effective, and therefore nations can trade much more easily.
Okay.
Now, I saw Dr. Davis was talking about the issues of import substitution. To a large extent, first of all, let me recall that Africa has been involved in trade for centuries, if you like. But it is trade that is based on being simply a supplier of basic raw materials to other regions. And I think in some way, unless we also take steps to move from basic raw material fruit suppliers and mineral suppliers to actual finished goods suppliers as well, we will not be able to build the capital goods that we will require in order to scale up our trade. That is why, up to today, Africa's participation in global trade is just a small proportion of its total trade, of the total global trade. Even within Africa, intra-African trade is just perhaps 15-16% of the total African trade, compared to other nations where you are talking about 50%, 60%, and even more. So in some way, we have to find a way to increase local production of consumer goods and services. We have to find a way of scaling up the production of capital goods, machineries, and equipment, and so on. That will increase the value of our goods and services. This is particularly so in terms of trade in goods. Perhaps in trade and services, it's a little less serious, largely because whereas trade and goods is something that we've been involved in for a long time on a disadvantaged basis. Trade and
engineer,
to a large extent, is something that has been growing in the recent past. And we can see that those strong African countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, like Egypt, have actually moved trade and services quite considerably. You go all over, say, the sub-Saharan African region, you see a lot of financial services.
Engineer, if you can hear me.
Management services,
Engineer,
insurance services.
I hope you can hear me.
Across different countries. So clearly, what has helped us to improve on trade in services is the fact that we are actually involved in the total value supply, proposition, whereas in goods, we are just supplying the initial, the less value raw materials and services. So to a large extent, yes, infrastructure is vital. for effective operation of the AFCFTA.
Okay.
And we cannot but have to take specific steps to improve the supply of infrastructure, not only within nation states, but also across regions. One thing we also may have to do is actually collaborate across countries. Different countries can work together to scale up their production of in a joint manner, in a collaborative manner. For instance, I've always made the example that Cote d'Ivoire produces cocoa, perhaps the largest producer of cocoa in the West African region. Nigeria probably has the largest manufacturing capacity to transform cocoa into chocolate and things like that. So if the two countries can collaborate so that you scale up the processing of cocoa and its actual transformation into chocolate between the two countries in a win-win situation by...
Okay, engineer, if you can hear me, I will come back to you in a bit, but let's get Mr. Jason Blackman's input. Mr. Blackman, if you're there, and I hope you're still here with us, if you take a look at trade, as we're discussing now, Africa Beyond Trade, Africa Beyond Borders, rather, the WTO Director General noted that trade costs in Africa on average are about 304% of tariffs. And it is understood that this number is almost 1.5 times the cost of trade in high-income countries. I want to know from your experience with movements of goods and services across Africa, would you say that the cost of trade within Africa is high? If yes, how do you see this affecting the implementation of the AfTA? And what do you think needs to happen to ensure that trade within Africa is seamless? Mr. Blackman, please. Mr. Blackman, can you hear us?
Sorry, I've got a bad sound quality. I couldn't. Something else was overriding your question. Sorry.
Oh.
Can I proceed with my response?
Yes, you can. You can. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So just very bad sound quality. So in terms of movement of goods across Africa and the cost of trade being very high, absolutely, it's always been one of the challenges in doing business in Africa is that the trade flows and the costs of those trade flows are significantly higher than in the more developed economies. And it's one of the issues that AfTA aims to try and address is to find a way of optimizing the trade flows, the customs processes, the cross-border processes to try and reduce those costs of doing trade. We often get asked for landed cost calculations, for example, by our customers, and to try and estimate what it's actually going to move, what's it actually going to cost to move goods from A to B within Africa. And that level of visibility is very, very difficult to try and achieve. There's lack of access to information. There's lack of visibility regarding regulatory harmonization. So in terms of our experience of movement across goods, absolutely, I think the previous speaker alluded to the infrastructure deficits and the impact that has on trade. That certainly affects the cost of doing trade. So traffic congestion, lack of capacity of transport corridors, a lot of that it directly impacts the implementation of AfTA because it doesn't help to support the objectives that AfTA have in terms of trying to reduce the cost of doing business within Africa. So from what we're seeing from a private sector perspective, certainly is that there is a lack of capacity building that needs to be significantly ramped up in order to achieve the objectives of the AfTA protocols and objectives. I think AfTA on paper is absolutely it hits a nail on the head. It's the practical realities on the ground that you see people struggling with, and communicating that across the region. How do we get change implemented? So from my perspective, for example, what are some of the issues that we see that affect the cost of trade doing business? Well, there needs to be that balance between duty and taxes versus trade facilitation. How do you strike a balance? So one of the things I'm trying to do is encourage and promote the use of higher de minimis thresholds under which duties and taxes aren't charged. We see a wide, diverse range of de minimis thresholds across Africa. In some countries, it's as high as $2,000. In some countries, it's non-existent. So across Africa, there needs to be a focus on how do we help and support the SMEs who are the ones that we think will benefit the most from AfTA. So how do we achieve that? How do we help support that? So what do I think needs to happen to ensure that trade within Africa is seamless and cost reductions that the AfTA aims to achieve? Well, one is capacity building. How do we support capacity building? And that's where the partnership between the private and the public sector becomes very, very relevant and very important. And the public sector needs to lean, for example, on the private sector's experiences in what they see on the ground, what they know works and what doesn't work. So certainly work in partnership, work hand in hand with the private-public partnerships. We need to look at how do we reduce the regulatory disharmony and fragmentation. There are so many different regulations in so many different countries that it becomes difficult and costly trying to understand them, trying to comply with them, and trying to comply with the different standards that apply in different countries. And so I'm going to be very interested, for example, to see how the harmonization efforts for the medicines control across Africa works out within that objective, because I think we'll see great opportunity there as a demonstration as to what happens if you can harmonize the flow of goods across the region, as is one of the objectives of AfTA. Is how do you harmonize that? How do you create a harmonized set of regulatory frameworks that everybody subscribes to, rather than having each country or REC or regional RECs working in isolation and silos from the greater good of the continent? The previous speaker spoke about the weak or inadequate transportation and infrastructure. That certainly plays a role. So, for example, in my company, I work for DHL, as you know, and this is not intended to be a DHL promotional campaign. But what we've done in Africa is we're present in all 51 sub-Saharan African countries, but we've made investments. We've put infrastructure in place that helps to support the economy. We have 14 aircraft, for example, across Africa that during COVID helped to maintain supply flows or supply chains. And that type of investment is needed to make sure that the borders remain open, that the supply chain continues to flow. And part of that, of course, is reducing the congestion at the borders, harmonizing your trade flows in terms of regulatory frameworks. We're also very much looking at how do you make the borders smarter. So looking at the smart border concept, how do you reduce your traffic congestion? How do you increase the collaboration between the private and the public sector? One example that the private sector is pushing for example, is pushing for representation on the National Trade Facilitation Committees, the NTFCs, and being able to be given a voice to be heard, because in those countries where the private sector is given a voice or a seat at the table, we're seeing development, we're seeing a push towards more optimized and more trade facilitatory approaches to doing business. We need to look at things like IT investments. How do we increase single window opportunities within the customs clearance systems? How do we increase, and for me the most important in my role, is how do we push the paperless trade agenda? How do we increase digitization as a means of reducing the costs of doing business by reducing the dependency on manual paper-based clearance processes, when one could move across to digitized approach using risk profiling and improved risk management? And part of that, of course, comes to capacity building. How do we upskill both the private and the public sector to effect change management, to harness the abilities and opportunities that digitization has shown, especially during COVID in many countries? Digitization has become more and more demonstrated as the way forward for increasing the objectives of AfTA and making sure that the objectives that AfTA have promoted are implemented. In terms of poor risk management protocols, we need to look at reducing inspections. We need to modernize our customs infrastructure. And as I said, a big focus on smart borders. And if we look at that as a means of reducing the costs, those will certainly play a major role in addressing the cost elements of the AfTA agreement and implementing it to make sure that it's seamless. It's not rocket science. You know, my philosophy and my role has always been going back to basics. The basics of trade facilitation, the basics of moving goods from A to B in the least amount of time and the least possible cost. And so part of that is transparency, simplicity, visibility, and harmonization of the regulatory frameworks, harmonization of the standards, those will all contribute to furthering the objectives of the AEC2021 in terms of development, but most importantly, the reduction of costs.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blackman. You've really said it all. And to our panelists, we have less than 6 minutes to go. So the next questions really, in less than 6 minutes to go, the next questions, I would appreciate if we can answer them like in a minute. Dr. Davis, I'll come back to you. Which of the African member countries do you think will benefit the most from the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area? And how do you think that member states can better position themselves to leverage the benefits? Dr. Davis?
Nancy, thanks. I'll be brief as requested. Let me be slightly sort of revolutionary here. You know, we talk about sort of need for free trade liberalization, obvious, and Jason's comments about regulatory complexity are really, that's the crux of the issue here. I would argue that what we need is true structural reform of economies at the same time trade liberalization in order to benefit. What I mean by structural reform, and this links to Mansour's point about infrastructural bottlenecks. One of the biggest frustrations for me in observing Africa and participating and traveling around the African economies in recent many years has been the sort of state-owned nature of key infrastructural nodes. Think port, think rail in particular. In the event of structural reform will allow private capital to invest and even compete with often moribund state assets in the infrastructure space. You can liberalize trade as much as you want, but if the infrastructure isn't there, I'm afraid the benefits will not be significant, to say the least. So with the free trade liberalization, let's have the structural reform. One thing that's disappointed me significantly over the years has been the relative lack of success with special economic zones. Jason talks about the complexity at the state level, at multiple levels of the state, of regulatory compliance or lack thereof and complexity. If we can get special economic zones, carved out dedicated geographic zones, mostly at the coast, reduce the complexity, digitize it, start afresh, challenge the existing vested interests of the bureaucracy that manages our trade or seeks to often impede the trade to that bureaucracy. Start afresh, digitize, carved out dedicated zones on the coastal areas, and then we'll start to see, I think, better progress coupled with structural reform. This is something which has underpinned growth of Asia the last generation or so. It's underpinned the growth of many economies in the Middle East as well. And it's about really tearing up the rule book of what we currently have, starting afresh, new zones, digitize the regulatory environment, crowd in private capital, particularly around enabling infrastructure. I think that'll be the real catalyst to real benefit from free trade, rather than trying to fix arguably was often a very broken system in many states in our own region. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davis. I'm coming back to you again, Jason. Engineer Ahmed, please just be on the standby because we have about 3 minutes to end the session. We're having another session coming up. Jason, the question to you is that what role do you think that companies and businesses such as yours can play at a time like this when we're talking about intra-African trade, when it has become a front burner issue? In about a minute.
So for us in the private sector, part of our focus is capacity building. How do we empower both private and the public sector to achieve the objectives of AFTA, so including training? We're running extensive SME training campaigns across Africa, especially about how to trade cross-border. So training and development is critical for us. It's stimulating awareness in AFTA and how AFTA can help businesses to achieve their objectives, and how do we push the AFTA agenda forward? How do we push the paperless trade agenda? It's about investment. So we're investing in aircraft, we're investing in infrastructure for road transportation networks. I like what Dr. Davies was talking about, trade liberalization. One of my passions is trade liberalization, and how do we free the regulatory shackles from doing business in a country? Because those regulatory shackles have the exact counter or hindrance to what facilitates trade in a country. And it's putting our money where our mouth is, essentially. AFTA on paper is great. It simplifies trade. It's translating the paper-based theory to to the practical realities on the ground. And part of the private sector's role is to work hand in hand, in tandem with the public sector, in collaborating on how best can we move the agenda forward and move that agenda to the next level. You know, as I say, it looks great on paper, but how do we put it onto the actual ground? How do we put feet on the ground in terms of generating the actual objectives into practical realities? And so my closing comments to the public sector who may be attending is to work hand in hand with the private sector. We can add great experience and great expertise to the developments. And in those countries where they've embraced the private sector's involvement, especially in countries like, for example, South Africa, where there is a number of private public dialogue forums going on, for example, we've seen the agenda moving forward. We're seeing the AEO program implementations, for example. We're seeing increased paperless trade. And so those are some of the focus areas that we're looking at from a private perspective in helping to further the objectives of AFTA. I know my time is short, so I will make my summary very brief. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. Finally, Engineer Ahmad, let's take your comments on this. What challenges do you envisage in the implementation of a borderless Africa, and how can these challenges you envisage to be managed? Very briefly.
Well, thank you very much. I think the challenges have all been highlighted, the challenges of competitiveness across the border, and particularly between the AFCFTA operator members as well as other producers, because AFCFTA is not just to affect intra-African trade. I think it's also intended to create a condition where extra-African trade can also be scaled up, where Africa would be participating in global trade at a much, much higher scale than it is doing at the moment. So I think some of the suggestions that have been made, I like Dr. Davis' suggestion of the coastal special economic zones, but this must also be, combined with the development of trade corridors across the various regions. Also, I think the process of public-private partnership, I believe that the engagement of the private sector in public policy is the starting point. If you went to public policies and regulations that states create, can only be effective if they are conducive to the operations of the private sector. So the first stage really is to make sure that involved in these policies, then of course the private sector must be fully consulted. There must be continuous engagement at every stage of policy making and the development of regulations. Thirdly, I think it is not just enough to make regulations, but I think we must also have a scheme that ensures enforcement of these regulations. The ECOWAS trade liberalization scheme, for instance, has all the regulations, but the countries individually are not complying with those regulations. So we must incorporate an effective compliance, managing compliance, monitoring system, and some definitely effective way of enforcing compliance with these regulations. Finally, I think regulatory harmonization is already incorporated in the AFCFTA agreement itself. My feeling is that this ought to be done, first of all, at the regional levels, so that you have regional common regulations. And the best way to do that is to, in each region, perhaps to look at the country that has the best regulation, transfer trade regulation, and then let that region adopt the whole that standard, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Thirdly, I think data, information, and digitization, I think these are key to improving trade at all levels, particularly in this context. As somebody else, I think it was Mr. Davis who said that most trade in sub-Saharan Africa, at least, is largely conducted by SMEs. And the problem with the challenge that SMEs face today is the lack of information, the lack of data to work with, particularly trade data, and so, of course, the manual, or if you like, non-digital way of managing this data. So digitalization in this context will significantly improve the ability of our SMEs to participate continental, regional, continental, and of course,
Okay.
ultimately global trade. So
Thank
yes,
you.
there are a lot of challenges, but I think if we really collaborate and cooperate, both between the private sector and the public sector, and secondly, between the nation states and the regions, I believe that many of these challenges can be overcome over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my distinguished panelists. What a way to begin the conversations that we'll be seeing the next 3 days. Thank you very much, Jason Blackman, Dr. Martin Davis, and Engineer Mansour Ahmed. I'm handing you over to Glory.